In the weeks following the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861 that began the Civil War, both North and South had resounded to the music of marching bands and the tramp of drilling feet as everyone flocked to the colors, convinced it was a lifetime's opportunity not to be missed. Most then believed the war would soon be over. Some said within the month, a few within the year. No one expected it to be longer. But by the summer of 1862, there had been for the North the humiliation of Manassas, and for both North and South, the bloodbath of Shiloh. Worse, though, was to come. Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, scene of bitter Union upsets. Despite successes elsewhere, the North was doing disastrously here in the East. The Southern armies relied for their food on this rich valley near the Appalachian Mountains. The breadbasket of the Confederacy was how some described it. The Union was determined to deny that sustenance to the rebels. But although outnumbering them here by more than 4 to 1, its attempts to do so failed, and the federal capital, a mere 60 or so miles away, was on occasion threatened. Barely 3 months after Manassas, the North had suffered another upset at a place called Ball's Bluff, just across the Potomac above Washington. The fiasco seemed to suggest that the Union troops, in the East at least, were still not quite ready. That winter, the armies sat it out around Washington. The popular song on both sides was All Quiet Along the Potomac Tonight, the words by a Northern woman and the music by a Southern man. During the lull, the camp photographers went to work. When spring came, Lincoln prodded his generals into action. Instead of doing so head-on, as at Manassas the previous summer, they preferred now to outflank the Confederates by shipping their troops down the Potomac to Fort Monroe, where the Federals retained a foothold. Richmond was only 70 miles away. But once the 100,000 men got ashore, they had to besiege one Southern bastion after another. The numerous creeks the Union troops had to cross also delayed progress. The rebel river batteries foiled the more direct approach. Following a demonstration in Washington by a scientist-cum-showman called Thaddeus Lowe, Lincoln sanctioned the establishment of a balloon corps that saw action in the Richmond campaigns. The balloons seldom went higher than 300 feet, which allowed the observer to see for 15 miles in every direction, and they were linked to the ground by telegraph. Flights at dawn were preferred. Not only were the air currents then usually favorable, but the intelligence gleaned from the location of campfires and the early movements of patrols could be most valuable. After bitter fighting, the Union forces by mid-May had pushed to within 5 miles of the Confederate capital. Panic seized the rebel leadership, but the Southerners fought back gallantly and halted the Northern advance at terrible cost to both sides. 11,000 casualties in one day, including the Confederate commander. His replacement now planned a counterattack at the point where the Union troops were most stretched and caught them on the hop. During 7 days of sustained fighting, some of the fiercest of the whole war, the Confederates forced the Northerners to retreat. The carnage of the Richmond battles was appalling. More than 30,000 died or were severely wounded. To Lincoln's great annoyance, the Union troops withdrew as they had come. The victor was Robert E. Lee, who had been the rebel replacement. He now became the North's bogeyman and the South's eternal hero. He had set in train a dramatic turnaround in the fortunes of war. A second confrontation at Manassas produced another humiliation for the Union. Realizing that a Southern victory on Northern soil might tempt the British to intervene and persuade the Yankees to sue for peace, Lee crossed the Potomac west of Washington, aiming to get behind the federal capital, but was halted along Antietam Creek. The ensuing battle on September 17th should have seen the end of Lee, since a quarter of his men dropped out through fatigue and he himself was injured. In addition, plans for disposing his forces fell into Northern hands. For days, the creek at Antietam ran red with American blood. It had been the bloodiest 24 hours of the whole war. Those who took part did not realize how much hung on the battle's outcome. Britain was poised to recognize the South. A Confederate victory here might just have clinched it, and also dampened the North's enthusiasm for continuing the war. But for those who fell amid the ripening corn, such matters were beyond their ken. Caring for the injured so taxed the local communities that the area became, according to a visitor, one vast hospital. A federal officer walking the fields the following day wrote, "No matter in what direction we turned, it was all the same shocking picture, awakening awe rather than pity, benumbing the senses rather than touching the heart." Within just 5 months of Shiloh, the viciousness of the war had escalated alarmingly, and many were now wondering where it would all end. Some of the bitterest fighting occurred here along this ancient sunken road, immortalized in this painting by a survivor of the battle, James Hope from Vermont. It has, perhaps inevitably, been known ever since as Bloody Lane. The Confederate dead lay 3 deep for half a mile, mowed down, in the words of their commander, like grass before the scythe. Lee was not defeated at Antietam, but his army was so bloodied that even though they had fought the Union forces to a standstill, they still had to retreat back to Virginia. Antietam was not just the bloodiest day in the whole Civil War, but the bloodiest ever in American history. 8,000 lives were ended here, and another 18,000 severely wounded. The casualties were 4 times those the United States suffered on D-Day in World War II. Entire units on either side were virtually annihilated. But Antietam was also notable for the advent of the professional war photographer.
When the war began in 1861, mentally, photographers saw covering a war as basically going to camps and taking very static groups of posed soldiers. In 1862, at the Antietam battlefield, this all changes because for the very first time, led by Alexander Gardner, you have photographers actually covering a battlefield before the ugliest scars, in other words, the dead soldiers, were buried. And these were very, very dramatic photographs. And the American public had never seen war depicted with the realism of Alexander Gardner's Antietam series, where you have bloated corpses, dead horses, etc. This series created such a stir that it was given more media attention than any other series before or after Antietam.
People were not used to seeing photographs of violent death. Lincoln went to Antietam after the battle principally to press his generals into pursuing Lee. But they were now too much in awe of him to do that, despite the rebels' disorganization. The Union president did take the opportunity of the stalemate, however, to issue his Emancipation Proclamation.
I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy.
Lincoln had realized he needed to counter the move within Britain towards recognizing the South after the Union's second humiliation at Manassas. The proposal he had in mind was freedom for the slaves within the Confederacy. When he had informed his cabinet of this earlier, they persuaded him to delay announcing it until success came in battle.
Or may be suspended or disturbed.
Lincoln morally detested slavery, there's no doubt about that, but clearly saving the Union was his ultimate priority. He said in 1862 in a famous public letter to the New York editor Horace Greeley that his foremost goal was to save the Union. If he could do it without freeing any of the slaves, he would do it. If he could do it by freeing all of the slaves, he would do it. If he could do it by freeing some of the slaves and not others, he would do that.
It was a crucial thing to do in military terms because as Union armies were advancing, they faced major problems of what do you do about fugitive slaves who come to the Union lines? Are they to be treated as slaves and sent back to their masters, which in fact was done in the early days of the war? Are they to be kept as contraband of war? Can they be enlisted in the Union Army? On the other hand, what is to be done about black workers who are in effect supporting the Confederate Army in the field? Can we strike at them in any way? Can we at least psychologically undermine that underpinning of the Confederate Army? All these were going on together. Now, in saying this, I'm really not trying to argue that Lincoln was not morally opposed to slavery. He was. He always had been from very early days. But he also said from the very beginning that he was making a distinction between his personal preferences, meaning his own moral judgment, and what he could do as president. And he did not think he could emancipate until it became a military necessity, as it so clearly did in 1862. Therefore, military necessity coupled with political necessity, coupled with the need to forestall foreign intervention, all these reinforced Lincoln's moral desire to work against slavery in whatever way was permissible for the President of the United States.
For Mary, hurrah for the Lamb, hurrah for the soldiers who didn't give a damn. And we'll rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Hurrah for
With Lincoln's
Mary,
Emancipation Proclamation, the war for Northerners had become one not just to save the Union, but also now to free the blacks. It meant they would be considered liberators, which gave them a moral aura.
shouting the battle cry of freedom.
The proclamation, coupled with Lee's retreat from Antietam, had effectively ended Confederate hopes of foreign intervention. Britain, with its anti-slavery tradition, could not side with the South, which would have to fight on alone against the North's superior forces.
The war was a bitter, destructive war because it became a war of society against society. Of course, it's always said the Civil War is the first modern war in many ways. It did not begin as such. It began as a conventional war of army against army, in which the distinction between civilian target and military targets were very carefully maintained or respected. But with the abolition of slavery, with the emancipation of the slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, this announced not only that slavery was going to die, but that the whole fabric of Southern society was henceforth going to be a military target. That to win this war, the North would have to really destroy the fundamental institution of Southern society. And this meant that there could not be any compromise, that the war would go on to unconditional surrender of one side or another, and that it would involve vast disruption among civilians as well as within the military.
Virginia's capital, seat of the rebel government in Richmond. Scene now of outrage at Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which was depicted as a deliberate attempt to incite the slaves to revolt. The Confederate cabinet sought to alarm conservative opinion in Europe by claiming the North was raising the red flag of revolution. But it was all baying in the wind. The rebels had lost the initiative, political and military. Jefferson Davis, whose home this was in Richmond during the war, the so-called Confederate White House, was proving no match for Lincoln, mainly, many thought, because the South's politics were not robust enough.
The Jefferson-Davis administration was unfortunate not to have a rival loyal opposition, because opposition to Davis took the form of sort of sniping and backbiting and obstruction instead of any planned, programmed, responsible alternative to Davis's policies. Jefferson Davis did an awful lot of things to keep the war alive and to mold his nation. And yet, as an individual, he absolutely lacked charismatic appeal. He almost seemed to do the things calculated to win enemies. Many of the problems that Davis faced internally came in the form of quarrels with state governors. What happened, I think, was that those governors resented the usurpation of their power by Richmond. Obviously, one of the reasons they had seceded was for the sake of state rights. And here was the Richmond government attempting to dominate, to form a consolidated union, which is precisely what they had tried to get away from.
Because there were not organized parties in the South, dissent from Confederate war policies, and there was a great deal of dissent as the war went on, particularly among poor non-slave-holding families and farmers who were literally starving often because they couldn't raise enough food to feed themselves, who were angered by certain Confederate policies that exempted one white man for every 20 slaves, whereas non-slave holders were going to be drafted. This dissent was expressed through desertion often, but it was also expressed in the hill areas of the South by open resistance to Confederate authorities. Large areas of the hill regions in western Virginia, western North Carolina, northern Alabama simply went into open opposition to the Confederate authorities, and the Confederacy had to divert military resources to put down this resistance.
Few farmers in the South had slaves. Only 1 in 4 white families owned them. The life of the Southern yeoman farmer, as here in Virginia, while certainly comfortable, was clearly far removed from the grandeur of the Mississippi cotton grower or the Louisiana sugar planter. Yet the families who inhabited these farms had not opposed secession at the start. Only when the war proved protracted and shortages emerged on the home front did they voice their protest, unlike their poorer hill farming neighbors who had denounced secession from the outset. It was the sons of farmers who seemed to bear the brunt of the slaughter at Shiloh and Antietam. Their families, too, often suffered most from the wartime privations. When conscription was introduced in April 1862, once again it was they who were worst affected. Conscription also aroused opposition because it was riddled with exemptions that favored the better off. If the feeling ever became widespread that the war was being waged at such appalling cost simply to protect the interests of the rich slaveholders, then dangerous cracks were bound to appear in Southern morale. Northern as well as Southern yeomanry were sturdy folk, but their patience was not always golden. Both leaderships would come to rely on the capacity of their ordinary citizens, especially the women, for continuing the struggle. Meanwhile, when Lincoln failed to persuade his generals to pursue Lee after Antietam, he appointed a new commander and straightaway urged him to move against the Confederates. Alas, with disastrous results.
We're standing on Stafford Heights overlooking the Rappahannock River and the old colonial town of Fredericksburg, Virginia, which really became the cockpit of the Civil War in the East. Fredericksburg lies halfway between Richmond and Washington, the two contending capitals, and was a transportation center. And thus it was inevitable that Fredericksburg would be the focus of the Army's attention for some 3 years during the Civil War. The first major campaign to hit Fredericksburg occurred in December of 1862 under the leadership of Ambrose Burnside, the Union commander of the Army of the Potomac. Burnside's plan was to cross the river on pontoon boats and then move against Fredericksburg before Lee's army could make an effective defense. However, Burnside's pontoons were late in arriving, and by the time he pushed across the river, Lee was waiting for him in a 7-mile-long impregnable line. On the morning of December 13th, Burnside launched repeated assaults against the strong fortification about a mile behind the town on high ground known as Marie's Heights, along the foot of which ran the sunken road and a stone wall. And this was a natural fortification for the Confederates. And some 13 individual assaults hurled themselves at this impregnable position in what resulted in a suicidal attack by the Union forces. 4 miles south of the sunken road, Burnside was able to penetrate the Confederate line briefly, but those Yankees were thrown back as well. And the Battle of Fredericksburg resulted in what many have called the most lopsided victory of the Civil War in the East for Lee, and the casualties were more than 2-to-1 in favor of the Confederates here. Another on to Richmond drive had been thwarted against the shield of Lee's strategy.
Never before in this war had so many men faced each other in battle. The Union losses were appalling. 12,500 dead and seriously wounded in just a few hours. Recriminations soon followed. For the South, Antietam appeared to have been avenged, while in the North, the bogey was raised again of Lee's invincibility, at least when defending his own soil. Morale within the Union ranks was as shattered as Fredericksburg itself. Despair among some officers turned into almost open mutiny as they compared the Confederate generalship with that of their own.
Generally speaking, the South's military leaders served her well. She had an officer corps which I think was clearly superior to that of the United States in the beginning of the war. Generally, however, Southern leaders tended to be very traditional thinkers, very skilled masters of the art of war as they had learned it at West Point, VMI, the Citadel, which were military academies in the South. They were masters of what they had been taught, but they knew so well those lessons that they had trouble learning others. I suppose the great exception to this was Lee. Robert E. Lee was a master of mid-19th century warfare, but he also contributed to it in trenches, in his capacity to divide his army in the face of an enemy and get away with it. I guess Stonewall Jackson is another example of an innovative Confederate military thinker and doer. Jeb Stuart in Lee's cavalry forgot all the lessons he learned at West Point, forgot everything he had been taught about European cavalry tactics because they emphasized a mass cavalry charge. Stuart had sense enough to know that wouldn't work. With the advent of rifles, with the massed infantry, he had better sense than to make beautiful targets for these people to shoot at. Consequently, Stuart was a master cavalryman.
Because of their better horsemanship, Southerners had the edge in cavalry tactics from the start. The role of the cavalry was changing, though. No longer was it the offensive arm of old. Now it played a much more auxiliary part in reconnaissance, carrying dispatches, attacking enemy communications, protecting their own army's flanks, scouring the countryside for forage, and even acting as military police in rounding up stragglers, as well as, of course, intercepting the opposing cavalry. The infantry still thought the cavalry led an easy life, galloping splendidly around the countryside instead of wearily slogging everywhere on foot. But the cavalryman had to care for his mount, even putting its well-being ahead of his own. Nevertheless, the cavalry always seemed to attract people with a liking for flamboyance and grandeur, romance and excitement. The Confederate cavalry had a reputation for wearing the most outrageous outfits, as well as looking like the most disheveled, cutthroat rogues imaginable. It was here in the West, of course, where the cavalry came into its own. Most of the early battles were hardly different in appearance from any fought a century before. Yet the means of fighting had changed dramatically. At the beginning of the war, few realized the difference the development of the rifled musket would make on infantry tactics. In the Mexican War, which was the immediately previous conflict in which Americans had fought, artillery had been the king of battles. Fire! But in the Civil War, infantry would reassert itself with a weapon that could kill a man at 300 yards and a good chance of killing him at double that distance. The old-style tactics of standing shoulder to shoulder while advancing en masse were doomed to terrible casualties. No longer would soldiers get off only one volley before being attacked with the bayonet. Most cavalrymen still carried sabers, though firearms were increasingly used. Union horsemen were generally the better equipped, but the rebels made up for these deficiencies with an abundance of dash and daring. Casualties were horrendous. Because of the new weapons and the numbers of men involved, it became ever more difficult for officers to control their troops. Most engagements were broken off before reaching a resolution.
The typical Civil War battle is non-decisive. The two sides come together, they bang the heck out of each other. They do hurt each other quite a bit, but they don't destroy each other. They disengage, they limp back, lick their wounds, and fight again another day. And the Civil War armies lacked the power to annihilate each other. They typically did not have the power to totally destroy the ongoing fighting capability of the other side.
Neither army had organized at the outset any system for finding and treating the wounded, who sometimes lingered for hours before securing attention. More men died from wounds received in battle than were killed in battle. For many, reaching the ambulances was the beginning, not the end of their agony. The casualty rates took the medical facilities on both sides by surprise. No one was prepared for the Holocaust into which the nation had lurched, least of all its leaders. In many ways, it was a mercy to be killed outright on the battlefield. Treatment was fairly basic, and often more dangerous than the original injury. If a man was shot in the arm or leg and a compound fracture resulted, amputation was almost automatic. After a battle, limbs would pile up outside the surgeon's tents. For anesthetic, the wounded would either bite on a bullet or be given a slug of whiskey. Doctors were not callous. It was just that medicine was still somewhat primitive. Few saw the need to sterilize instruments to avoid infection. Amputations often took place in the open air under makeshift conditions. Scant attention was given to hygiene in the few field hospitals that existed, which were little more than groups of tents where men lay on the bare ground. For the amputees and the other severely wounded, there was no attempt at therapy to prepare them for the shock of civilian life. Mothers and wives only learned of the fate of their dear ones by reading about it in the local newspaper or seeing their names pinned up on a notice board in the nearest town. After a major battle, all the largest buildings nearby would be commandeered as hospitals. Much the most effective medical care, in the North at least, was provided by non-governmental bodies, such as the United States Sanitary Commission, modeled on the British agency established during the Crimean War by the legendary Florence Nightingale. The Commission's formidable ladies successfully badgered the Army bureaucracy into improving living conditions of the ordinary soldiers as well as medical standards. Among their reforms was the establishment of specially built pavilion-style hospital wards. The fate of prisoners was often as hazardous as that of the wounded. It was as dangerous to be captured as to remain in combat. Although some still argue to the contrary, Confederates fared better at Union hands than vice versa. Richmond's Libby prison was particularly notorious for its ill treatment of Union captives, though Andersonville in Georgia was the worst. Starvation and lack of sanitation killed inmates by the thousand and produced scenes of unparalleled horror. One Southern woman was so shocked by what she saw there that she confided to her diary, "My heart aches for the poor wretches, Yankees though they are, and I am afraid that God will suffer some terrible retribution to fall upon us for letting such things happen."
America had never had to contend with large numbers of prisoners at that time. In the American Revolution and the War of 1812, battlefield paroles were given to the relatively few number of men who were captured. In the Civil War, with 3 million men in the field fighting, the number of men taken prisoners was so large that neither side felt it expedient to use paroles, so they began the problem, attack the problem of what to do with prisoners of war, and they had no guidelines, and both sides made terrible mistakes. The sites of the prisons was almost consistently incredibly bad for reasons that no one can say. The administration of the prisons was an administration marked by incompetence because it was based on ignorance, and thus suffering was very, very intense. 56,000 men will die in the prisons of North and South. And it's a story that would best be forgotten, but for the fact that all those men perished, and that should teach us something.
Oh, Johnny dear has gone away.
As well as the problem over prisoners, dreadful as it was, both sides had to cope with the fact that troops spent far more time in camp than in battle. Boredom ensued. Music helped.
Johnny has gone for a soldier.
There were other distractions, of course, but music played an important inspirational role as well, far more than in any other war the United States has been involved in before or since. The Civil War stimulated a vast outpouring of sentimental and patriotic ballads. The same tunes became popular with both sides.
For a soldier.
sell my clock, I'll sell my reel, I'll sell my flax and spinning wheel to buy my true love a sword of steel. Johnny has gone for a soldier. Shoot, shoot.
Each camp had its sutler or private trader who sold a few luxuries as well as necessities. But Southerners, above all, enjoyed telling each other tall tales. The taller, the better.
Shotguns, 12 gauge, loaded with one single ball. One of those, the fellow's name was Gray, and the other one was Poe, I believe. And they were friends, and they got into it, and they had that damn duel, and they fired once and missed, I believe, with a shotgun at 60 feet. I mean, that close, that's just double.
Yeah. 3 of the guys around never marched. The other part did it on Georgians. They don't know how to march.
We're going to teach them, huh?
The Southerners were tremendous fighters. They were bold, they were reckless, they were tenacious in their ability to withstand hardships and things of this sort. But they were probably better fighters than soldiers. Their units could sustain horrendous casualties and still continue to fight. It was not unusual for a Confederate unit to suffer 30 or 40% casualties in a single battle, and to suffer these casualties over and over in repeated battles. But they were not disciplined. They were not patient. They were very much as their Celtic ancestors had been. They were marvelous, as old General Winfield Scott, himself a Southerner, said, they were marvelous in one wild, mad dash if they could win it all that way. But they couldn't stand the waiting. They couldn't stand the months of inactivity.
There's an old maxim of Napoleon's that I think Lee remembered very well, that the inferior side must be the most audacious side. Take the war to the enemy before the enemy can use his greater strength, maximize his force in the field. Audacity, always audacity.
In the early part of the war, the Federal Army cavalry was mounted by city people. They had to strap them on the horses, and they sold them these patented tin, several layers of tin breastplates on the theory that they would survive. Well, they slaughtered them all up and down the Shenandoah Valley that way. But the Southern kids rode like centaurs, and they were always hungry. So the infantry, so it's charged, was brave because they knew there was cheese in those knapsacks in Blue Line.
Vicksburg on the Mississippi, some 400 miles upstream from New Orleans, was still, to Lincoln's annoyance, in rebel hands. Baker's Creek, 20 miles east of Vicksburg, now became the scene of much Union activity. Ever since the Battle of Shiloh the year before, the Federal troops in the West under Ulysses S. Grant had been trying to clear the Mississippi Valley of rebels. It had, of course, been the North's aim from the start of the war to divide the Confederacy from its friends across the river. Preventing that plan from succeeding was the rebel bastion at Vicksburg. Grant had tried to attack it by the long overland route from the north, but had been so harried by Confederate cavalry that he had to give up. Now he was trying to approach the bastion from the south and east.
Casualty coming and going.
Check the barrels and make sure they don't have any mud in them. Without doubling. Yeah, I am. Right face. Arms at will.
The Union forces had cast themselves loose from their supply base in early May 1863 and were living off the land. They had burnt the Mississippi state capital, Jackson, which had not pleased the rebels, who were now on their track. The Federals were having problems fighting in the woods. Unable to gauge the strength of the enemy, they were inclined to be cautious. The Confederates certainly still had some fight left in them, especially when provoked. After all, this was their country, and they resented the Yankees' incursions.
Hey, Yank!
The commander of the rebel garrison at Vicksburg had sent part of his force to tackle Grant's invaders. They met at Champion Hill, halfway between Jackson and Vicksburg.
Commence firing. Raise your head, Johnny, I'll blow your brains out! Where's an officer? Hey, from bridge. Let's get across. Keep pressing. Yeah, you! Here. You going up here? Keep pressing. Push up, push up. More cartridges, right? We got a heart attack for you, rebel!
Not bad as I that you get.
Get across the board! Yeah, Captain.
The Confederates mounted another delaying battle here on the Big Black River, 10 miles nearer Vicksburg. Although not as bloody as Champion Hill, where more than 1,000 men had been killed, it was just as decisive. Rebuffed yet again, the Vicksburg garrison withdrew within their defenses. Thinking final victory was his for the taking, Grant attacked straight away, but was thrown back with heavy losses. He tried a second time a few days later with the same result. He resorted to assaulting from the river, but his gunboats were repulsed by the Confederate shore batteries. Once more, the casualties were considerable. Anxious to avoid a siege, Grant threw everything into another attack. His colleague, William Tecumseh Sherman, confided to his wife, "This is a death struggle." But with his soldiers hungry and his supplies dwindling, Grant faced the inevitable and settled down to a siege. Vicksburg's garrison and citizens now faced daily bombardments from Grant's field artillery, which completely surrounded the town. Vicksburg was also ringed by massive earthworks that ran in a 7-mile arc around the town. No Union force had yet faced such impressive defenses. Penned inside the circle of cannon were 34,000 soldiers and civilians. Besieging them were 50,000 Federals. Perched high on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi, Vicksburg commanded the great river's middle reaches. And as long as Vicksburg held out, passage down it was denied to those Midwestern farmers who were among Lincoln's loudest critics. They had suffered badly from the South's secession, and Lincoln was keen to recover their support. Because of the continual bombardment, most Vicksburg civilians spent their time in caves burrowed into the hillsides. There were 500 of these caves. What kept people going was the hope that somehow they would be relieved. But the Confederates were faring better in the east. Lincoln had again changed his commander and had pressured him into battle in Virginia.
We're standing on a portion of the Woods Road that Stonewall Jackson's Confederate Corps used on May 2nd, 1863 at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Jackson's column was on its way during a 12-mile march around the front and flank of Joseph Hooker's Union Army of the Potomac in what became one of the most important and memorable tactical maneuvers of the Civil War. Late that afternoon, Jackson launched a flank attack against his Union opponents here and overwhelmed them in a brilliant maneuver which had seized the initiative from the Union forces. This was a reversal of what the campaign had been up until this point, when Hooker had marched his army upriver from Fredericksburg and crossed the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers in places where the Confederates had not guarded the river crossings. He had everything going his way, but then surrendered the initiative to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, which proved to be a fatal mistake for his army at Chancellorsville. Unfortunately for the Confederate cause, and in one of the most ironic twists of the Civil War, Jackson was reconnoitering in front of his own lines at the height of the attack, ready to renew it and administer the coup de grace to Hooker's forces, when he was mistaken for Federal cavalry by members of his own army and accidentally shot and mortally wounded. He died 8 days later, and despite the fact that the Confederates went on to win the Battle of Chancellorsville in what became known as Lee's greatest victory, the loss of Stonewall Jackson to the Confederate cause was by far the most significant outcome of this engagement.
Lee could now do no wrong in his leadership's eyes. He determined to press home his advantage by again invading the North, hoping a further victory there might so damage Union morale that Lincoln would be forced to negotiate a peace. Within the month of Chancellorsville, Lee crossed the Potomac west of Washington with 80,000 men, and a week or so later had penetrated Pennsylvania as far as its state capital, Harrisburg, aiming to destroy its rail links with the West. But the Federal forces, under yet a new commander, were hard on his heels near the little market town of Gettysburg. It was a shortage of shoes that brought the rebels to Gettysburg, where there was a footwear factory. When a group of Confederate infantrymen made their way into the town in search of shoes, they ran into some Union cavalry. Thus began the most important battle of the Civil War, and perhaps the most crucial in American history. What opened as a skirmish, in the end involved 160,000 troops. The Southerners drove the Northerners from the town onto a gentle ridge near the local cemetery. Lee urged his generals to dislodge them, but they hesitated. By the time they moved, the Federals had brought up reinforcements and had dug themselves in. All that second day, some of the bitterest fighting raged at places now forever etched in America's memory. Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the wheat field, the peach orchard. However great their courage, the rebels could not shift the Northerners. Lee's colleagues tried to dissuade him from continuing to attack such a strong position, but he was convinced one final push would do the trick. He determined to strike where he thought the Union would least expect, in the center of their line on Cemetery Hill. For this, he would use General Pickett's division, Virginians like himself. As July 3rd dawned, they assembled in the woods opposite Cemetery Hill. The die was cast for the war's climax. The Confederate cannon opened up on the hill. Then, at 3 p.m. precisely, the guns gave way as the Virginians emerged from the woods. Many Northerners admitted afterwards that the Virginians had appeared irresistible. Certainly, they were one of the most awesome sights of the whole war. Pickett's charge was about to begin. The rebels advanced through the fields of ripening wheat. As they neared their goal, the clump of trees atop Cemetery Hill, the Federal artillery suddenly blasted forth to scythe through the gray-clad ranks. The slaughter and noise were horrific. For another hour, the battle raged as the Southerners pressed on. As ammunition ran out, men grappled hand to hand, using their rifles as clubs and their bayonets as spears. The few of Pickett's division who made it to the hill were cut down in their brief moment of glory. Soon the remainder were falling back. Less than half made it home again. Nearly 7,500 were left on the field. At the very moment Pickett had begun his charge, Vicksburg was at long last surrendering. This dual defeat was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Abandoning their dead, the Southerners withdrew to Virginia. They had suffered 28,000 casualties in 3 days, nearly 40% of their force. Four months after Gettysburg, Lincoln made a rare excursion to attend the dedication of a new cemetery there. He spoke second, after the main orator had delivered a formal 2-hour address. Lincoln's speech lasted little more than 2 minutes. Many of his audience scarcely heard him, and much of the press considered his paltry few words unequal to the occasion. But they were to become an indelible part of the political thought and language of the whole world.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
In seeking to define the war aims of the Union, Lincoln arrived at a definition of democracy itself. He at least never had any doubt about the universal significance of what was happening at Gettysburg and on all the other battlefields of the Civil War.